All right, so today we're going to look at something that might seem really, really simple. Basic English conversation.
Okay.
You've shared a podcast episode with me that's designed for absolute beginners.
Yeah.
And we're going to kind of unpack it together.
Sounds good.
Now, you might be thinking, wait, a podcast analyzing another podcast?
Right.
It sounds a bit meta, I know. But trust me, the goal here isn't just to repeat what's in that beginner episode. It's to actually, equip you, the listener, with tools to use simple English effectively.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is how much you can actually communicate with just the small number of words.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
If you have a really clear structure.
Okay, so let's unpack that clear structure bit then.
Okay.
The podcast that we're looking at starts out with the classic subject plus verb plus object sentence structure.
Right.
They use the example, I eat apples.
Mm-hmm.
Solid, but maybe a little basic, right?
Yeah.
I feel like we can do better.
Okay.
What if we threw a T-Rex and a runaway cheese souffle into the mix?
Interesting.
What kind of sentence could we create with that?
T-Rex chases souffle.
I love it.
Short, sweet, and
Right.
it gets the point across.
Absolutely. And it shows you don't even need that much vocabulary to get a point across, like an action.
Exactly.
And it's not even just about memorizing a formula.
Right.
The Source podcast really emphasizes repetition, and that makes sense, right? It's like learning a dance move.
Yeah.
You got to practice those basic steps over and over again until they're just like second nature.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really interesting was how mastering those simple structures, it actually builds confidence.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because if you know you can get a thought across clearly, then it kind of takes the pressure off.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. And you can think of it like building a house.
Oh, do you?
You know, you lay a solid foundation, and then you can start to add more and more complex elements on top of that.
I like that analogy.
You know, you can start adding adjectives and adverbs and eventually even more complicated sentences.
So speaking of building blocks, let's move on to introductions. So the beginner podcast gives the very, very classic.
Yeah.
My name is blank. I am from blank.
Right.
I am learning English.
Right.
Useful for sure, but maybe a tad generic.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's functional, but it doesn't really stand out.
Yeah.
It's missing something that makes a good first impression.
Yeah, you want something more memorable.
Yeah, you want to give people something to remember you by.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So how do we spice things up?
Well, one of the things that the Source podcast mentions is adding something personal,
Okay.
not just your name and where you're from, but a detail,
Okay.
like a hobby, something that you're passionate about, or even just a fun fact about yourself.
Okay.
Give the other person something to start a conversation with.
Oh, I like that. So instead of just saying, I like watching movies,
Right.
you could say, I'm obsessed with classic film noir.
Yes, exactly.
Or for a listener who loves history,
Yeah.
maybe I'm fascinated by ancient Roman plumbing.
Yeah. There you go.
Suddenly, it's not just an introduction. It's like a conversation starter.
It's an invitation
Yeah.
to learn more.
I like that a lot. And it shows how even a simple sentence can be effective
Right.
because it makes you be clear and concise, which is super important, especially if you're a beginner.
Yes, especially for being understood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when you can actually get your point across,
Mm-hmm.
you feel more confident.
Yes, exactly. It's like this positive feedback loop.
Oh, I like that.
The more you communicate clearly, the more confident you become and the better you communicate.
So we've got this foundation of simple sentences.
Yeah.
We've spiced up the introductions a bit.
Right.
Let's get to the real meat of it, actual conversations.
Okay.
What did you find really interesting about how the Source podcast approached conversation?
Well, one of the things that they emphasize is reciprocation.
Okay.
So it's not just about, asking questions.
Right.
It's about sharing information about yourself, too.
Okay.
So there's this balance.
Right.
So it's not just a one-sided interrogation.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So it's like a tennis match,
Yes, exactly.
back and forth.
Back and forth.
But how does the Source podcast recommend doing that with simple language?
Well, one of their key points is to follow up a question with a comment about yourself.
Okay.
If that's related to the topic. So, for example, you could ask someone, where are you from?
Right.
And then you could share something about your own hometown
Oh,
or
yes.
a place that you've traveled to that you really loved.
I get it.
So you're kind of creating a connection
Okay.
and inviting the other person to tell you more about their experiences too.
So it shows that you're not just asking questions to be polite.
Right.
You actually care
Exactly.
about what they have to say.
And I think it shows respect too.
Yeah.
Even though we're just talking about simple sentences,
Yeah.
it's a very subtle but powerful way to show respect and build that rapport.
Because everyone wants to feel heard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to feel heard and understood.
So we've got the foundation of clear sentences,
Yes.
the importance of personalizing those introductions.
Right.
We talked about the power of that back and forth in conversations. What's next in our little deep dive here?
Well, the Source podcast then moves into some really key questions that go a step beyond just the typical, how are you?
Okay.
And what's interesting to me is that these questions are pretty basic,
Right.
but they can actually lead to some much deeper conversation.
This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how they do this.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key takeaways there?
Well, they really highlight the question, what do you do?
Okay.
And it seems so simple, but it can tell you so much about a person,
Yeah.
like what they're passionate about, what they're good at, what makes them tick.
Yeah, you're right. It's like a really good starting point to get to
Yeah.
know somebody,
Mm-hmm.
but it can also be a little tricky, right?
Yeah.
Depending on where you are in the world,
Definitely.
like what's normal in one culture
Right.
might be considered way too personal in another culture.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
think that's where the beauty of these simple sentences comes in.
Okay.
Because they can be adapted,
Yep.
So instead of being like, what do you do? Which can sound a little blunt, you can say something like, what keeps you busy these days?
Oh, that's a good one.
Or, what are you really passionate about?
Oh, I like that one too. It's more inviting.
Right.
Less like an interview.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love how you brought in that cultural context.
Mhm.
It reminds us that even when we're talking about like the technical parts of language,
Yeah.
there's this whole other layer of like social awareness.
Yes, communication is about so much more than just words.
It really is.
It's about understanding those unspoken rules
Right.
and being sensitive to different ways of interacting.
So being a good observer.
Yes, exactly. Paying attention to how people interact
Yep.
and what's considered appropriate in different situations.
Okay, so we've got this question. What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Which can be really powerful for
Yeah.
starting a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need to remember that cultural context
Right.
and maybe adjust how we ask it.
Exactly.
What other good stuff did you find in this podcast?
Well, they talk a lot about yes and no questions,
Okay.
which again might seem super basic,
Right.
but they're more useful than you might think.
Okay, I'm intrigued because you said earlier that yes and no questions can help you express your opinions and preferences.
Yeah, so think about it. Even a question like, do you like coffee?
Okay.
Can lead to a much bigger conversation.
Right.
Because instead of just saying yes or no, you can give a little more detail.
Okay.
You can say something like, yes, I'm a total coffee addict,
Uh-huh.
especially dark roasts.
Right.
Or you can say, no, but I love tea. Green tea with a hint of mint is my favorite.
So it's like you're adding a little something extra
Exactly.
to the conversation.
Yeah, you're sharing a little something about yourself.
Yeah, and it goes back to that idea of reciprocation. Like
Mhm.
you're not just answering the question,
Mm.
you're inviting the other person to share something too.
Exactly. And even though it's a simple yes or no question, you're still building that connection.
Okay, so we're seeing how these simple questions can be a lot more powerful than we might think.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, I know the Source podcast also includes a role play section.
It does.
What did you think about that?
I thought it was a really cool way to show how all these different elements come together in a real conversation.
Okay.
The simple sentences, the personal details, the back and forth, the yes and no questions.
Yeah.
It all comes together to create a nice flow.
Okay. I'm really curious to hear how they do this. Do they give a specific example?
They do. They imagine two people meeting for the first time in a coffee shop.
Okay. Very relatable.
Yeah, and it starts with just a basic greeting like, hello, what's your name?
Okay.
And they emphasize, saying your own name back.
Right. So that reciprocity again.
Exactly. It establishes that balance from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then they might say something like, nice to meet you. Where are you from?
Okay.
So it's an open-ended question, which gives the other person a chance to say more.
Then just one word.
Right.
Yeah. And again, thinking about different cultures.
Yes.
It might be totally fine to ask, what do you do at this point?
But in other cultures, you might want to stick to something more general.
Yeah, like hobbies or interests.
Exactly. So you got to read the room a little bit.
Yes.
But the main point is that even with a limited vocabulary
Mhm.
and basic sentences,
Yeah.
you can have a really good conversation.
Exactly. You can connect with someone and learn about them.
Okay, so we're seeing how this role play brings everything together.
Mm-hmm.
The simple sentences, the details, the reciprocity, the open-ended questions.
Yep.
Do they give any tips for keeping the conversation going?
They do. They really emphasize active listening
Oh.
and looking for those connections between what the other person is saying and your own experiences.
I like that.
So, for instance, if they say they're from a particular city,
Right.
you could talk about a time you visited that city.
Yeah.
Or if they mention a hobby, you could mention if you have a similar interest.
That's such a good way to make someone feel heard.
Exactly, and to build that rapport.
Yeah, and you don't need fancy vocabulary or grammar for that.
Nope.
Just that willingness to listen and find common ground.
Yes, and it really highlights that human element of communication.
Yeah.
It's not about showing off.
Right.
It's about genuinely connecting with another person.
And that goes beyond language, right?
It really does. It's a universal desire to connect and understand each other.
And that brings us back to the power of those simple sentences.
Yes, because they allow us to communicate those basic desires in a
Right.
way that's clear and easy to understand.
Yeah, especially when you're still learning.
Mm.
I love how you tied that all together. It's like a reminder that even though we're getting technical,
Yeah.
the goal is to use those technical skills to actually build
You can
relationships.
connect with people.
And the Source podcast really emphasizes that. They
Yes.
talk about how even if you make mistakes,
Right.
even if you stumble over your words, the most important thing is to keep practicing,
Yeah.
to keep trying, and to hold on to that desire to connect.
Such a good message. It's about the journey, not just the destination.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Simple sentences,
Yeah.
reciprocation,
Yeah.
asking and answering questions,
Right.
cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
What other insights did this beginner podcast offer?
Well, one of the things they talk about is expanding on those yes and no answers.
Oh, yeah, we touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, they give some really specific tips for adding more detail and context.
Okay.
So you're not just giving a one-word answer.
Okay.
You're actually opening up the conversation.
You know, that's something I personally struggle with.
Really?
Yeah, I tend to just say yes or no, especially when I'm nervous.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm really curious to hear what they recommend.
Yeah.
What are some of those key takeaways?
Well, they encourage listeners to think of yes and no questions as a starting point, instead of an ending point.
Okay.
So, for example, if someone asks you, do you enjoy cooking?
Right.
Instead of just saying yes,
Yeah.
you could say something like, yes. I find it really relaxing to try out new recipes. Or, yes, and I really love making dishes from different cultures.
So you're using that short answer to tell us more about yourself.
Exactly.
Okay.
And even if the answer's no,
Hmm.
you can still say something interesting like, no, but I'm a huge foodie and I love going to new restaurants.
Okay.
Or, no, but I'm always up for trying new things, so maybe you could teach me how to cook sometime.
I like that because it keeps the conversation going
Right.
instead of just shutting it down.
Exactly. And it shows that you're interested in connecting with the other person.
And it's sneaky practice for those basic sentence structures.
Oh, that's so true.
You're using those subjects, verbs, and objects without even thinking about it.
Yeah, it's like building those language muscles without even realizing it.
I love it. So you start with the basics, and then you can gradually add more complexity.
Exactly.
This has been such a cool deep dive.
It has.
It's amazing how much we can learn from looking at the simple things.
Yeah, and I think it's inspiring to see that anyone can communicate clearly,
Mm-hmm.
even with just a few words. It's about those core elements, like using that subject-verb-object structure, adding those personal details to your introductions, remembering that back and forth, and getting comfortable with those yes and no questions.
So if our listener remembers those key things,
Mm-hmm.
they can really start building their confidence and having great conversations in English.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that learning a language takes time.
Oh, for sure.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Every time you stumble or hesitate, it's a chance to learn and improve.
It really is all about the journey.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to share one last thought from the Source podcast.
Okay.
They asked this question. Imagine you're in a coffee shop and you hear someone struggling to speak English.
Mm-hmm.
Would you try to help them out with a simple phrase or question?
That's a great question.
It is. It really makes you think about how we can use our language skills to make a difference.
Yeah. And it shows how a small act of communication can have a big impact.
It's a beautiful reminder that language is more than just words. It's about connection and understanding.
Well said.
So as you continue your language learning journey,
Mm-hmm.
remember to keep practicing, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep that desire to connect alive.
And don't forget the power of a simple sentence.
Right.
It can open up so many possibilities.
Until next time, happy learning, everyone, and happy connecting.